Wonderful. All right, so everybody, welcome to the next big thing. The first thing I'm supposed to do here is say thank you to all of the wonderful sponsors, and we really do appreciate that. Somewhere in here, if you guys could start closing the doors over there and take out your phones and scan this QR code. The QR code is the code for the Slido that will be used for moderated questions at the end of the session. The idea behind the Next Big Thing talks is that they're quick talks, they're light, they're engaging, and also do that. And also, as part of that, there's an interactive Q&A at the end. And so I'll be introducing each of the speakers, and as I introduce the speakers, then they'll come up. The next thing is, so our first speaker is Shane, and Shane is from Anduril. He has his PhD in VR, spent 20 years at PhantomWorks with Lockheed, and this is his first ITSEC back after 10 years, and manages a portfolio of applied AI and autonomy. So let's give it up, Shane.
Cool. I think I've got this mic. Is the sound level okay? People can hear me? Yep. I need the clicker. Can I grab the clicker? Thanks. All right, let's get into it. So the talk that I want to give today is really around how do we teach robots how to fight, and then to make the case to this community that I need help and companies like Anduril from the modelling and simulation community to help us do that. So to contextualise things, in recent times, a country's power was quite often depicted in its military and in exquisite and very small numbers of exotic assets. In order to have, a strong country could afford these platforms and then use them to exert their will onto the smaller nations. The example here of Vladimir striding very confidently from his stealth aircraft, 5th generation Su-57 Falcon there, just ready to walk all over any country that might get in front of him. Now, of course, we know in the recent conflict in Ukraine that was not the case. So robotic systems used very deliberately and smartly were able to repel a much bigger foe and change that balance of power, if you will. So how we kind of take that forward and what this looked like was this disproportionate or asymmetric effect of taking these systems that were thousands of dollars and making impacts on other systems in the Russian force structure that were tens of millions of dollars. So the video that you're seeing here is some of the Ukrainian remotely piloted warriors finding, fixing and affecting various armored vehicles, and being able to do that and inflict this impact from fairly low cost systems. They were able to do similar things with against also aircraft that were hundreds of millions, order of magnitude more, and surveillance aircraft as well that were of the order of $1 billion each. So this was very significant. So what do these unmanned or the remotely piloted warriors look like? So in Ukraine, this is an example of what one of these warfighters look like. They've got the fully immersive headset that the full motion video is streaming into. Typically some sort of interesting communication setup here. The antenna's a little bit unusual for this one, but it's still a human with hands on stick and throttle. So human creativity in order to figure out what to find, what to fix, what do I track, how to navigate into complex areas like you saw inside that the particular barn to find the armoured vehicle, and then what to engage. Now, a lot of that's been made possible because of fairly close ranges. So the ability to beam that back to the human has been possible because of the relatively small ranges. Now, as we look to the future fight against the PRC or China, this is very different. China's done an excellent job at creating anti-access and area denial capabilities. This particular graphic is just one example of their ballistic missile capabilities, all designed to keep the West out and as far away from the battlefront as possible. And they've got similar capabilities for cyber and other bits and pieces. So we're just not going to be within contact of the fight. So this concept of the human being in the loop all the time is just not going to be reality. So how do we get the robots to understand and act just like the human does? So the United States government, as one example of a military force that kind of understands that this is a problem and everyone agrees that we need to pivot. So there's about $2 trillion that's now going into major development programs, be it air defence, UAVs, UUVs, loitering munitions, and all of these need an increasing level of autonomy in order to be effective, particularly in the great power competition with the PRC. So Andrew, as an example, we're working on a bunch of these particular systems. And just to give you some context, here's our sizzle reel to give you a feel on some of the systems that we're working. But we need to create the brains, if you will, for these systems to be capable and effective and safe in the future fight, along with a lot of other companies, FSI and Shield, etc., who are in the audience here. But robotic fighter aircraft, special forces, helicopters, unmanned underwater vehicles in particular are super challenging because you're not going to be in comms. Underwater, comms mechanisms suck. Like, it's terrible. RF's hard enough, but acoustics is even worse. So how do we create the environment to train these robots in becoming a lot smarter? So how do we replace things like the 10,000 hour rule for a human to become an expert in something? And in doing so, that we can make sure that they're effective as those Ukrainian warfighters in being able to navigate from the big picture to the small picture to affect things hiding in barns, etc. And how do we know that they can do it safely? So we can have some tools in order to assess how safe that particular behaviour is, etc. So back in the 80s, this is how you got good or trained to get smarter. I always love a training montage. I think there's enough people old enough in here that you've seen some of these movies. But how do we replace this? And certainly ITSEC has been a place to use simulation, VisSim, things like that to get people smarter. But how do we do it for robots? That's the big question. So how do we go from the 80s training montage to something a bit closer to this? I don't know if you've seen this movie, but...
Combat training. I know Kung Fu.
I know Kung Fu.
Sure.
Instant download. So in effect, in the Matrix, Neo and the rest of them were agents in the system. So how do we create that environment such that there's that data upload disk that can go into our robots? So it's part of the prospect that the way we think about it is, in addition to your typical mission planning process, or mission cycle rather, of planning, operate and debrief, is to have a precursor which is called mission design. So in the mission design environment is somewhere to create, formulate tactics and test them to see whether or not they're effective and safe. This looks and smells a lot like computer-generated forces and all the tools that get used out here for scenario planning, etc., but for doing that for the robot. How do we do that? In doing so, we need to create an environment that the robots don't perceive that they're in a training environment. So how do we get tools to replicate all the sensors and the stimulus that come into the robots using sensor simulators, multimodal, some of the synthetic terrains, etc., that's shown on the floor? How do we give it a bunch of different variations to see how resilient it is against different scenarios, and how do you bound that so it's not everything? And then how do you get the repetition in such a place that we can give feedback to the warfighter who's deciding whether or not this tactic is safe or not and effective, that we've got metrics against that so we can build these things up. So an example for the perception and some of the help that I'm seeking, and I'm sure others, is to create different tools that can create training data sets synthetically that are rich enough that the machine learning and various similar tools where we might be doing tracking, We might be doing terminal guidance, etc. This is an example of a particular tool that's looking at different targets in the maritime environment, different weather conditions, different times of day, and can generate many millions of training data sets or images that go into the ML, which we can then use to for the targeting, for the sense and avoid, etc. But not just for the EO that you're seeing here, the electro-optic view, want that for IR, want that for multi-spec, hyperspec, etc. With the ability that that's all correlated, and for all then the different sensors that I may have on the vehicle, which could include sonar and other bits and pieces, is stimulating that particular robot enough that they can be trained for those types of environments. I'm sure that's made everyone sick. Should I turn it off now? Cool. The next one is then the variation. So having some sort of scenario-based environment where it's not necessarily everything, it's impossible to simulate everything, but it's very much driven on what are the decisions that may be made as part of a tactic, and threat-driven as well. So what are the key elements, if you will, ranges, decision points that you may have, so it's much closer to a choose-your-own-adventure for those who used to read those books. I don't know if anyone read those books. But there's tools that actually help us with a multitude of various scenarios that we can then have the control environment, if you will, to test against. So that really gives us the flexibility for the robot, like how many situations can we rely that it might be useful in, and how effective is it? So you can start trialing, okay, can we take down this particular threat? You know, how many are we losing? That type of thing, but an environment that allows the person, because there's still a human in the loop here, who has the 10,000 hours of experience, tactical warfighter who's then teaching the hundreds or the thousands of robots type thing. So this is kind of a toolkit for them. Then the last piece is the repetition. So having something that looks and smells like a risk-based environment, if you will, where we're looking at the likely failure mode. So as we're going through a scenario, to be able to turn on and off sensors failing, or flight parameters not working, or subsea movements, whatever it is, to have a look at and to figure out like how safe is this? So what is the probability, both not just of the effectiveness, given everything is green path, but injecting then a whole heap of red path situations, such that the warfighter knows in this particular situation, you know, this is the low risk, it's always going to work, but may only be medium probability of success. I've got a high probability of success thing, but it's a high risk as well. So the tools do the Monte Carlo, be able to give us the stats that can come back. So when it comes to time of actually selecting this particular behaviour or tactic, that we've actually got some metrics that sit behind that saying, this is what you're signing up to if you download this program, you know, what version of Kung Fu it is for what outcome, and we're able to give that particular feedback. So for me, as we enter into this domain where there's increasing autonomy, how are we going to train these robots is really critical. In order to create this mission design environment really is going to be from you guys, I believe. Creating these synthetic environments, adapting what's on the floor here today, that's primarily been built for training humans to do the same thing to train robots. So with that, that's me.
So the first question was, how do you manage the risks of making lots of different scenarios in order to train against versus making those part of your training set? And how do you look at validating against that risk assessment? Like, how
do you not overfit?
How do you not
Is that what you're
overfit,
saying?
but also how do you manage creation of a risk assessment on a battery of tests? So you don't want that battery of tests to be in the overfitting data set, but also you do want that to be inside of your training set.
Yeah. So look, I think there's existing science in order to achieve this, or methods. So we're not necessarily inventing anything new there. We're just seeking to apply it. but having some of the opportunities to kind of train in our own spaces, and then we were talking earlier about the integrated battle experiment, T-Rex, and some of the activities that OUSD do, etc., to kind of have the opportunity to then face, some environment that hasn't been done before at our own test ranges. So the more that we can do that, and the support from the military and the government for us to do those bigger exercises, is a big part of this as well. So.
Okay, wonderful. So to the audience, the Slido questions are open. So standing by a little bit for additional Slido questions, or we can do the old-fashioned pass the mic around. Charlie, sorry. So what do you think about the increased training that will be needed for humans to work with their robot counterparts?
Yeah, so that's the intent wasn't to kind of display a binary situation where it's either humans or it's robots. There's obviously going to be a graduation between those two. So in doing so, creating environments that are some variation on this, but with the trained robots, but in a simulated setting, will kind of work, I think, a lot freer. So I still expect that'll be reuse, if you will, or reimagining of the same training devices and training approaches. You'll just have virtual representations of those robots as part of the training curriculum. But they'll be reflective and probably more representative because it's the actual real mission code that's running for the training as it is for the real life. So that's the intent.
So that brings to the next Slido question, which was that the last slide mentioned training in the human and the machine, and how do you envision like team training with a combination of both robotic elements and human elements simultaneously?
Yeah, so I think it will be in sequence. So you need to kind of teach the robots in an environment like what we're talking about, and then bring that to, say, some sort of manned-unmanned, crewed-uncrewed teaming kind of construct. And then look at what's still of great interest to us is how much human on the loop or in the loop is necessary, because I don't think anyone really knows. So through the training environment to kind of have a look at, and that may be a sliding scale as well, depending on the intensity. So the training environments are actually going to be very useful to help us understand even like how much human intervention is actually needed as part of these autonomous systems. So.
And so as part of that, the autonomous systems are likely making use of some amount of foundational models. And at least over in our labs, we're noticing that the change between one foundational model to another can be a little bit disruptive. And how disruptive are the new foundational models when you either swap out or have to validate or risk assessments, or how does the new foundational model affect the robotic systems you're deploying?
Yeah, I mean, they need to be validated. So that's a key process where the model can't exist in isolation. So certainly having a set of rigs, if you will, from software in the loop to hardware in the loop to surrogate testing to the objective system testing is a big part of that. So each of the models have an opportunity to be validated at each of those levels. But without that, it's garbage in, garbage out. But to have that as part of the process, that the model does not get used unless it is validated against one of the above software levels is kind of central to the process, certainly in our experience.
And on the other side of that, it's been said that like high individual performance groups don't necessarily make good team members. How do you anticipate the high performance robotics interactions inside of the team? And will we have to create more accommodating robots to deal with imperfect humans?
That's a great question. The nice thing about the robots is they're pretty deterministic, so the reliability's there. But overall, if the supervision sucks, the robot's going to suck too. So, it will at least be consistent in its actions, regardless of kind of who's asking it to do the same duty. So,
and so then the next question was regarding the combined human AI team. So you have a human and you have a robot, and they're part of a team, and that team has a technical lethality / performance measurement. And how does that technical lethality performance measurement inside of the United States capability set measure up against peer threats?
In an open forum here, you want to know?
in as much as an open forum as you can, sir.
I mean, the need for this crewed-uncrewed teaming is, I don't think anyone disagrees that that's important in the future fight. And for what it's worth, I mean, the bad guys are working on all the same stuff. And in some areas ahead of us, so, yeah.
And so then I think the final question prior to a few minutes of break in here is how far off is the infrastructure needed to support the compute at the edge to drive the decision making for the robots? And if you could reflect a little bit on the infrastructure needed to multiple questions were related to this, on the infrastructure needed to collect data, collect sensors, send it back, get it processed, provide an update, provide human validation over top of that update, provide human on the loop, make that part of the team, integrate that into the training, and the whole pipeline has lots of compute, infrastructure, sensor, data-centric cost. And if you could reflect on how far along we are on the infrastructure on that and how much more is needed to be done.
Yeah, it's here. I mean, we have systems in Ukraine today that we're doing software updates every 24 hours. It's a fallacy that the capability's not there to do at edge processing now. It's a lot of work to get that right. There's a lot of thinking around the verification of the software updates because we're used to having these big, long, safety regimes around stuff. But how to approve incremental updates, be it just behaviors or patches to systems, it's actually the regulation that's the blocker, and why we've had a lot of success in Ukraine in particular, because the need's been very great. I think in the West more generally, that's probably the bigger blocker. It's not the technology, it's the regulation.
Gotcha, and thank you very much.
Cool, thank you very much.
So thank you guys all for the great questions. And so next up we have Dan Animal, who is the Chief Technology Officer for EPISI. He's had a focus on autonomy and AI. And prior to joining EPISI, you might note that he has the code name Animal. That's a 24-year military career and I'm afraid that I have to read this one. Culminated in assignment as the commander of Detachment 6, Air Force Operational and Test Command, and has been evaluated the operational effectiveness and suitability mission capability for the A-10, F-15, F-16, F-22, F-35, and other advanced aircraft. And they reported the results of the major acquisition program basically everywhere. Fine results are reported.
All right. Is this thing on? Yep. Thanks a ton for that. Yeah, I go by Animal. Dan Javorcik go by Animal from the Muppets, if you're old enough to remember the crazy drummer guy. If I learned anything from 25 years in the military, it is that while data are interesting, it's really stories that move people, and so that's what we'll start off with. What you see behind me and what I'm holding on a stick here is an F-16. The F-16 fighter jet, if you're not familiar with it, you'll notice that it has only a single seat, so there's only one seat in it. There are some versions that have two seats, but the vast majority of training that occurs for new pilots happens in the single seat aircraft, and that's going to be important here in a second. Additionally, the F-16 was unique when it was introduced in 1974 because it was the first aircraft that was fly-by-wire. And what we mean by that when we say that it was fly-by-wire is that before the F-16, aircraft, when the pilot was flying them, was actually physically and mechanically connected to the control surfaces of the airplane. So think an old biplane or a World War II aircraft or even Vietnam-era airplanes. The pilot would make an input to the stick or the throttle. It was mechanically connected to the actuators. Sometimes they were hydraulically boosted, but in the end, you were physically connected to that. In the F-16, what was probably one of the more revolutionary things about the airplane at the time was that they no longer had that mechanical connection. And now, instead of being physically connected, you made an input to an inceptor. The stick for the airplane is actually located on the side of the airplane, not between the pilot's knees like most aircraft are or predecessors were. And as a result of that, you would make an input to the stick, and you still do to the F-16 today. You make an input to the stick. It translates that into an electrical signal, which then is passed via wires out to an actuator that creates that command. And that's important because if you have an electrical signal, then that means being able to intercept that and do interesting things doesn't require any massive modifications to the mechanical parts of the airplane. And so before we get on to the video itself, if you're not used to seeing heads-up display footage, this is a view out the front of the airplane. And I've got a bunch of the parameters that are projected on that display to the pilot. But I don't want you to get too wrapped up in the numbers here. Suffice it to say that the heads-up display that the pilot is looking throughout the front of the airplane projects attitude information, it projects altitude, airspeed, and a whole host of just important information. And that's what we're going to see in this video clip that we'll play in a moment. Instead of focusing on any particular number, I'm leaving this up here a little bit so you can kind of look to see what the different parameters are. But instead of focusing on any single one, I'd really like you to just kind of watch the video as it plays through, pay attention and listen to not only the pilot's breathing and the sounds that you kind of come from within the cockpit, but also the radio transmission from his wingman, who is basically playing bad guy in this training set. So this is a basic fighter maneuver training scenario for a student pilot, kind of like the two airplanes that I showed before. The pilot who is performing the training in this particular case is the offensive aircraft. In the offensive aircraft, the defensive aircraft is being played by his instructor pilot. And so he can see what's happening by just looking out the window, but he can't actually affect what is happening to the other airplane. And we'll play through it and we'll watch what happens.
Fuel recover. Fuel recover. Fuel recover. Fuel recover.
So I'll kind of I'll talk you through a little bit about what we just saw. The pilot entered his turn circle entry basically right before the video starts. They initiate the fights on, which initiates that engagement. He pulls a large amount of G, which is basically a force not due to gravity, but we measure it in terms of gravity, that basically pulls all the blood out of his brain, and he G-locks himself. He basically loses consciousness. When that happens, he's the only one flying the airplane, but he's now unconscious. And so the aircraft begins a kind of a slow roll and a descent. In order to preserve his energy, he's in full afterburner. And so the entire time this is happening, he's let off the G because he's passed out. The airplane has drifted to 55 degrees nose low, 135 degrees of bank. It accelerates through the Mach. He actually ends up at a little over Mach 1, and he is completely passed out, and he is 8,000 feet from the ground, which is not very high for this kind of a maneuver. Fortunate for him, if this had happened to him and it was before 2014, he would have been a fatality. And for pilots like me, when we see videos like this has a very special, or not a special in a good way, but an emotional moment that we feel simply because we've all lost friends to precisely this sort of a problem. What happens here, though, as you saw from the video, is the aircraft, fortunate for this pilot, the automatic ground collision avoidance system is activated in this very nose-low, accelerating toward the ground situation. It then takes control of the aircraft. It rolls the airplane to wings level, and it pulls at maximum G to a little over 9 Gs. I think it peaks out at 9.1 Gs to recover the aircraft for him. All the while, you can hear his instructor pilot telling him to recover, but he's not going to respond because he is incapacitated. The remarkable piece about this, and it was widely celebrated and won the Collier Trophy in aerospace, was that the airplane that did this obviously could have done it from the very beginning, and yet it wasn't implemented until 2014. And so there were a whole host of us that were willing to ask the difficult question of why did it take 40 years for this life-saving software to make it onto an all-electric jet? And I'll ask you all, why do you all think it took 40 years? Anyone? Anyone? The pilot flies the machine? That's right. It was not technology, right? Like, it's easy to kind of jump to, at least my mother-in-law to jump to, it was technology that was the limiting factor. No. In fact, we had autopilots on airplanes since 1912. In fact, shortly after the in fact, before you had a cruise control in your car, you had an autopilot on an airplane. So that certainly wasn't technical. It also wasn't budgetary. Right? A lot of people say, well, it was too expensive. The cost to implement the software for this particular life-saving device was less than the cost of one loss of an airplane. And since we started recording data for this in 1990, we've lost over 50 F-16s alone, and more. So that is a low and conservative number for the budgetary argument for this case. The reason was exactly like you said, sir. It really came down to psychology, and those psychology can really be broken into two things. It can be broken into culture, and it can be broken into trust. And so, if you think about the cultural piece, like the ballad of John Henry from the folk songs where in 1870 he was a steel-driving man, he competed against this steam drill that he won, but in the win he lost his life from exertion, and like portended this rising threat from a new and emerging technology. The exact same thing has happened before. In fact, I take you back to 1938 and the Mounted Cavalry of right before World War II. Right before we went into World War II, General Herr, he was the last chief of the cavalry. Basically, General Marshall, who was in charge of the War Department, said, listen, we've been seeing this kind of crazy mechanized divisions storming through Europe right now, through Poland. The Germans are using internal combustion engines in ways that we've never seen before. What is your answer for the Mounted Cavalry? And his answer was, listen, we've been thinking about this for a really long time, and you know what? We've got a perfect solution for you. We are going to trailer our horses to the front line. Because we've trailered them to the front line, they're going to be fresh, and they will ride circles around the tanks, and will be victorious on the battlefield like the thousands of years that we have before. And it was at that moment that General Marshall basically canceled the cavalry, right? The reason, it's easy to look back on that and that story and kind of say, with hindsight, General Herr is silly. But if you put the perspective of the individuals who are sacrificing daily to accomplish that particular mission, it maybe makes a little bit more sense. You have a disruptive emerging technology, and in that disruptive emerging technology, it threatens the heritage, the honor, the virtues, or the values, and even possibly the dignity of the people who have strived and worked their entire lives to get to this particular point. And that understanding and that recognition is a very important aspect of this. When you look at it, the cultural reluctance to this sort of technology back then is exactly what we have risk of seeing repeat itself now with artificial intelligence, machine learning, and its application of, we saw the LLM talk earlier today that kind of covered these sorts of things. In fact, unless you've been living under a rock, you recognize that we are living at a very unique moment in our history. For millions of years, we interacted with our tools via the hunter-gatherer age. The agricultural age lasted for several thousand years. The industrial age lasted for maybe a couple of hundred. And the information age has lasted for a few decades. And so a quick show of hands, how many of you are augmented cyborgs? Okay, I got 3 hands raised and a chuckle, right? Which is pretty common. But if I were to ask you that story about General Hurt earlier, later tonight over cocktails or something like that, it's almost second nature to reach into your pocket and pull out one of these, right? We are very accustomed to, thanks to the revolutions in the digital world that have happened, to take for granted the fact that we are, in fact, augmented in a lot of ways. And if you think that you are augmented by just using your cell phone, imagine these pilots that are flying in airplanes like this one or the F-22 that I've got shown here. In the F-22 and the F-35 and all of these fighter jets, the pilot basically straps themselves into a flying computer that has ability to see for hundreds of miles in parts of the spectrum that they were not born with. They can go higher, faster, farther than anything that was ever really imagined with before the 20th century. And all of these things basically indicate that we are, in fact, living in a completely new age, an augmented age, where human decision-making and creativity is starting to be challenged and assisted as we elevate human performance to completely different levels. The question, though, is how do we build trust in these particular systems, right? I said that there's a psychology element of why there was that reluctance to adopting the automatic ground collision avoidance system on the F-16. And that really was framed by that cultural piece, but also how do I build trust in systems like precisely like this? If you think about our tools for millions of years have been exclusively passive. We ask a tool, we build a tool so that it does exactly what we want to do, only when we want it to do it. And if it doesn't do those things, we say it's broken, we go back, send it back, and get another piece of it, another tool like it. However, these tools are seeing a revolution, right? They are going through a transformation right now where they are bringing in far more than just the classic passive types of traits. They are becoming intuitive. They are exhibiting creative types of behavior. And that transition is one that is fundamentally challenging for all of us and is important for us to get right. When you think about these particular systems, it's important to not bias yourself to, say, blind faith, but also not to that skeptical rejection that we saw that delayed the implementation of automatic ground collision avoidance on this airplane. In fact, when you look at the model for this, oftentimes I talk to non-pilots and I explain that an F-22 or an F-35 or a fighter jet is really nothing more than a fancy motorcycle, right? That just happens to fly and do some cool things. But in each of these cases, that fancy motorcycle is very deterministic and passive. And this Harley motorcycle is in fact very different from Harley the horse. So Harley the horse, why do I always talk about this sort of thing? Harley the horse, my family, my wife and I and our 2 daughters, we have 4 horses, 1 for each member of the family. So I got a lot of time dealing with a tool that has a mind of its own, literally. And I will tell you that the way that you build trust in a tool that is passive is very different from the way that I build trust in a teammate. When our warfighters go into combat, they rely and they trust 3 things. They need trust in themselves, they need trust in their systems, and they need trust in their teammates. And right now, we are beginning to blur the lines between each of these. And so it's kind of funny maybe to think that you come to ITSEC and you see some stuff on horses. And I'm telling you, I think that there's probably a lot more that we can learn from our relationship with horses than initially meets the eye. And that's because my horse Harley here is actually quite a bit smarter than most of the AI LLMs that you were hearing about earlier. And the reason for that is that, when I go to Harley's turnout and I have a saddle, Harley knows that we're going for a ride. And in order to do that, he had to pay attention. He had to remember that we did this before, and he had to build a pattern of that activity in his mind, and this is something that computer science and artificial intelligence has been trying to work on for more than 70 years, and we're making great strides in doing precisely these sorts of things. But when I go to do testing, which is my profession and my vocation, when I go to do testing on this, I test a passive motorcycle very differently than the way that I test a Harley the horse. To give you an example of a test program for a motorcycle or an airplane, we build test plans, we build these rigorous, you heard Shane was talking about the hardware, software in the loop, the hardware in the loop lab, the surrogate testing, the limited flight testing before you actually go onto the vehicle itself, vetted through multiple processes. When we go to test, how do you test putting a 2-year-old onto a horse, a 1,500-pound animal like that? Let me give you a story. I have a daughter. Her name is Amelia. Amelia is the youngest of our 2 daughters. She watched her older sister, Mary Charlotte, riding around all the time by herself. She was 2 years old. She said, "Dad, I think I'm ready to ride by myself." I said, "I don't know. We're going to build some repetition here." So we do a lot of walking around. I explained to her multiple times. We went over. In order to make the horse go, you need to wag your legs, you give him your reins, and you tell him to walk on, right? So we practice. We finally get to the day. She says, "Dad, it's my turn to ride. I'm riding by myself." She doesn't quite say it like that because she's only 2. But so I stand there. She's got the halter is off. I'm holding on to this is a different horse named JR, holding on to JR's bridle. I let go. She says, "Nope. Get farther away." So I take 2 big steps back. And I said, "Okay, you've got the reins. It's your turn to ride." And what does she do? She raises her legs up and she goes, "Yeah!" I'm telling you, my heart bounced off the sand because I could not reach JR in that moment. What actually happened was that JR basically looked behind him and then he took a step and walked off. I was so fixated on my accurate model, my theory of mind model that I have for my horse and building trust in the horse, I didn't realize I had improperly calibrated to my 2-year-old daughter, who it turns out had watched Strawberry Shortcake that morning, and Strawberry Shortcake says, "Yeah," to get her horse going in the video. The point is that there's an awful lot we can learn from building these sorts of relationships, and we talk about teaming. We talk about teaming with artificial intelligence, machine learning. When we talk about collaborative combat aircraft and human-machine teams, almost everybody in this field focuses that discussion on this model for a passive closed system. And nobody talks about it from what it takes to build a relationship, a theory of mind for my teammate. But that is, in fact, how you build trust in teammates. And we're all familiar with this from doing sports and that sort of stuff when we were younger. And what you find is that this new model is, in fact, what is necessary to appropriately handle these sorts of things in the future. And so I'll end with a video from cattle work. Now, if you look at cattle work, and this video that's playing behind me is one of cutting. If you imagine a system where I need to separate a single cow from a herd, these prey animals do not like being separated from each other, and they have lightning fast reaction times because that's how they've survived for millennia. In fact, if I were to ask you to do this with a motorcycle, you would be completely incapable of separating a single cow from the herd. And the reason for that is your reaction time and the motorcycle's reaction time are insufficient to be able to get inside the decision cycle of that heifer that you're trying to separate. But instead, with a horse, a well-trained horse, this is actually quite simple. You sit, you command the horse from your position, you then relinquish that particular command, you give them the opportunity to do their job, that narrow, very precise task that you ask them to do, and they do it fantastically well, right? They're able to separate the horse from the herd. And when this is done well, in the equestrian world, we call this harmony. You're in a symbiotic relationship with your teammate. It's not a human teammate. And I'm telling you, Harley has many times done things that were unexplainable and very black boxy when you don't understand how it is that he makes decisions. But fundamentally, the two work together in a way that allows us to arrive at something that is greater than the sum of each of the individual parts. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to strive for with human-machine teaming in the future. We don't have enough people that are trained in the teaming element of this. In fact, when I showed up at DARPA as a program manager, one of the first questions I asked is I said, hey, quick show of hands, how many of you are psychologists or a degree that ends in ology at all, right? And the answer was no hands went up. It was filled with engineers and scientists. I have a PhD in physics, so I kind of, Big Bang Theory, understand a lot of the weird statements that are said in that. The takeaway here is that if we want to effectively team with artificial intelligence in collaborative combat aircraft in environments like the ones that you saw earlier in the talk earlier, you fundamentally have to be willing to approach this a different way. I think the model that we use with our animal teammates that human commanded and AI controlled is absolutely the right way to do it. And fundamentally, if you don't want it to be rejected by the people that you're building this artificial intelligence and this augmentation for, you need to have them co-opt and co-develop the tactics with the technology with you. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
So the first question came in is, what are the specific training components that need to occur in the human agent team, i.e. the human and aircraft, that you've learned? Like, what needs to be trained in order to train that cohesive unit?
All right, well, so that's a bit of a vague question, so let's break it down. The first thing is that the system has to be performant enough. If it's not working properly, like you would ascribe to a passive system, then fundamentally the utility is quite low. So you have to get it through a lot of the architectural things that we discussed earlier, the software in the loop, hardware in the loop labs, those sorts of elements. When it comes to the actual interactions with it, the limitation that you oftentimes have with human beings is that we're not able to go faster than real time. We can't be parallelized. I can't build a league structure if you're familiar with league population-based training methods. So you inherently end up finding that you have to build a model of the human as a surrogate in the earlier training aspects of the development of these models, right? And so what ends up happening is you develop that early, say, the initial parts of it are to get you a performant enough agent that can handle the passive situation, and then you begin factoring in the human interactions with that. And if the humans seem to like it, then you're usually in a good place. What we often find at EPISI is that systems that are not hybridized or hierarchical end up struggling. And this is not something that's unique to EPISI. It's also something I saw industry-wide when I was back when I was a program manager. When I say hybrid and hierarchical, it's not unlike the discussion that was, or the presentation in the session before, where they're talking about compound artificial intelligence. This is allowing different AI agents that are good at certain tasks to be kind of blended together in a way that allows you to gracefully degrade and regress when it turns out that the human machine team isn't working the way that you expect it to. And although it's very fashionable to do deep reinforcement learning end-to-end types of approaches, it turns out there's a lot of stuff that we've actually already solved and that we do quite well. And a heuristics-based solution does end up working an awful lot in a lot of situations. So,
thank you. So the next thing is that the aircraft autonomy has a significant leg up over other sorts of autonomy. You brought it up first that the aircraft had some measure of autopilot prior to the car having any measure of cruise control. And of course that autopilot was the low and flow flying, just keep everything steady, and the cruise control was just keep everything at the same speed. That's right. Those were the low hanging fruits of the time. Many of those have been now incorporated into autonomy features. Mm-hmm. What are the low hanging fruits now? Mm-hmm. We have some measure of takeoff and landing. We have some measure of low and flow flying. What are the next things on the horizon for autonomy?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, there are two basic approaches that you're seeing in in the commercial self-driving car industry, as well as being very slowly adopted in the airborne one. And that is, you can have driver assist or pilot assist feature rollout that allows you to collect an awful lot of data, allows you to interact with your user, and that's exactly what we're seeing with a lot of these kind of basic, say, cruise control, or in the case of basic autopilot that you see for, say, unmanned, uncrewed systems that really don't do anything other than go take off, fly around, and go take pictures of stuff, basically do intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance types of missions. When it gets into tactical implementation, it becomes a lot more challenging. In fact, at DARPA, we pushed for dogfighting or basic fighter maneuvers, kind of like the opening scene of what we saw with the automatic ground collision avoidance system, not because we care about dogfighting, but because it turns out that that's the low-hanging fruit, one of the low-hanging fruit elements of this. One of the things that we did in we called that the Alpha Dogfight trials, a bunch of trials where we had autonomy basically fight each other in this kind of round-robin execution, and then eventually fight against a human pilot. In each of those cases, what nobody paid attention to, if you go back and watch the YouTube videos, nobody paid attention to two agents, Zombie and Rosie, that were extremely important. And I will tell you, the AI nerds kept wanting me to pull those agents out because everyone wanted to see a tough fighting opponent. And the reason why I kept Zombie and Rosie, Zombie basically was a cruise missile that flew straight, and Rosie was a entity that just kind of did random 30-degree bank turns and some small maneuvers, but very light maneuvers. And the reason for that was precisely the low-hanging fruit. What is the low-hanging fruit today for tactical artificial intelligence? It is cruise missile defense. So if you think about a saturation attack on Guam, the way the adversary is going to attack a strategically placed island is they're going to have these big, strategic, costly things that come up high and fast. And we have a lot of resources to kind of engage those high and fast things. But what we really care about are the low, slow guys, because the low, slow guys are the ones that will saturate, that are less effective. And that's what's basically being borne out today in Ukraine, is a need to protect against that. That's the low-hanging fruit for tactical AI.
So speaking of that, there's some advantage on the AI systems, and those are rapidly coming up on human-like decision-making. But at the moment, there's the human trumps the AI order of thinking, that when the AI and the human disagree, whatever the human does, that's the right thing, obviously. We're coming on a point where the AI will perhaps have better suggestions than the human, and the question from the audience was, how far away is that point, and when do we start making trade-offs between human degradation, human sleep, all of those other things, and start trusting the AI more than the human under certain circumstances?
Oh, boy. If you want to get pilots riled up, you call them the horsemen and cavalry of the 21st century. And where I'm going with that is, all of us like to say, hey, I like a driver assist feature. But at what point do I turn over all of this autonomy to that system? The first piece of that is, that's already going to happen. With CCA, Collaborative Combat Aircraft, there is no pilot to be in the cockpit overriding that, right? So there will be an element to this. There also is a piece that a lot of people don't recognize, that your willingness to accept risk is very dependent upon your actual contextual situation that you are in. If we're not in a shooting war, then I'm going to be slow and deliberate. And all of America's DoD acquisition systems have built these incumbent processes that take forever, and essentially have gotten us stalemated in development of these sorts of systems. The second the bullets start to fly, your willingness to accept risk changes. Building your autonomy, it's very important, and this is probably a foot stomp moment, it's very important that you build your autonomy with the hooks available to realize that Move 37 type of a moment. Not that, if you're not familiar with the Move 37 thing, go watch AlphaGo documentary and it'll make more sense. The point is that you don't want to cut yourself off from truly creative and insightful types of things, but in that building trust model that I talked about with a passive system, anything that is new and unexpected is not considered a feature, like you heard in a talk two talks ago. It's actually considered a massive problem with that particular system. However, if you're getting shot at, maybe you're willing to accept a little bit more risk in turning that particular feature on. And the question becomes, and Shane brought this up before, the limitation right now is not technology. It is policy, it is the bureaucracy. That doesn't mean that we should just take all regulations and guardrails off, but we certainly can hurt ourselves considerably against our adversary by clamping them down too much. And the question is, can you leave hooks in to allow for insightful type of behavior when the conditions change on the ground and you're willing to accept more risk than the one that you are making the decision at right now? And that's a tough question that only the operational or the commander on the ground can decide at that moment.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Get to rearrange furniture here. So the next big thing this year is a mix of sessions. So the first type of session, which we just saw two of, is the TED style talk, engaging talk, light on visuals, heavy on QA. The second of these types of talks is the fireside Q&A. So with that, we have Leah Rowe up on stage and Dr. Chris Palmer. And I figure I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, given that you're going to be running this QA.
Well, excellent. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. So good afternoon, everybody. We realize that we are the last stop between you and happy hour at the floor. So thank you so much for being here. I guess I'll briefly introduce myself, and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Palmer to introduce himself. And then we will run this as a fireside chat, question and answer session between the two of us. So Leah Rowe, started my career off supporting the Air Force at the Air Force Research Lab for 19 years. Very recently have entered into industry, and right now am at Booz Allen Hamilton. I am an ology kind of person. All of my degrees are in psychology. And I'm just really happy to be here today with Dr. Palmer to talk about human-machine integration.
Thanks for having me. I'm Chris Palmer. I'm the first Principal Director for Human-Machine Interfaces at OSD R&E in Critical Technologies. The critical technology areas were stood up by Congress and established by Honorable Shu, or the CTO at the time, to highlight a gap in the DoD that needs to be addressed. We have two major functions. One is to make more persistent and endemic the work needed in human-machine interfaces across the services in the department, i.e. raise the resources across the spectrum. And the second is to accelerate near-term opportunities where they align with our service gaps and needs. So I think that's good enough for now. Tomorrow, however, at 3, I will have a chance to reveal our inaugural first roadmap in the Navy building for much more of a deep dive of where our focus areas lie and what our initial vision, strategy, and roadmap point towards after the last 10 months of engagement with all of our stakeholders, which is industry, academia, and of course all the services.
Excellent, good. So with that, we will start the question and answer session. So really, I am excited to be here with you today. And not just because we're sitting and I've got like 13,500 steps in for the day, but because I am really excited about your mission and what you're supporting. And it's been really excellent to get to know you over the last 18 months or so. So diving right in, my question for you is, so this is my 18th ITSEC. So I've watched a lot of this human-machine integration technology be built throughout the years and transform and change. I'm wondering if you believe the technology is ready for prime time.
Yeah, so I think the answer is definitely yes, definitely maybe, and definitely no, right? So I'll categorize it in the big 3. I think there's a lot of use cases where the DoD has failed to adopt technology that's ready. I think there are a lot of use cases and contexts where we don't quite know if it's ready. And there are quite a few use cases where we are way over our skis, projecting what's not real, and it's definitively not ready yet. And I think it gets, again, to what Shane and Animal raised with regards to the human and the ologies, which I am also one, and a tech developer and deliverer for SOCOM and JSOC in my past. So I balance the human with the need to deliver technology. But the truth of the matter is that human hasn't been at the forefront of this. So until we get those use cases and experimentations really well funded, then unpacking how we better inform the engineering that's supposed to be human-machine teaming, we can't get there. So the easiest of use cases that have been adopted, I think. There's a bunch in the middle that we think are near-term kind of low-hanging fruit, but without the experimentation, what we used to call analysis of alternatives and concept exploration, to unpack not just what the gaps are, but how the humans have to have it implemented to tell the engineers, then we're going to continue to have this gap. So I think it's ready in a lot of ways, and I think the reason the CTA exists is because there's a recognition that the gap needs to be closed relatively rapidly over the next 5 to 10 years.
Excellent. So why do you believe that thus far the DoD has not found it important enough to provide and fund HMI requirements?
This is near and dear to my heart. And as a PM, as a concept developer and requirements writer, I think it comes down to a couple different things. This is always funded around the edges in the S&T communities compared to the large. I think it's nested in a larger problem in the DoD, and the problem is everything associated with human. So as a PM, you have a DoDI for Human Systems Engineering and HFE. It is entirely waivable and scratchable by the PMs. More importantly, every requirement associated with human falls into what's called an additional system attribute. So our testers, when they test this, only have qualified information and nothing to measure it against in most cases. Whether it's the F-35 PVI or it's the RAS control in C2 of our switchblades or any kind of systems, it's underspecified. And that's because an ASA is not a key performance parameter, must meet, or key systems attribute, tradable within objectives and threshold. It's down at the bottom, and it's usually written something like, and make sure it works for the warfighter. It might have something else, but I'll tell you what, it doesn't have any numbers. So until we get human requirements into the KPP zone for critical systems, which isn't every system, but systems for which human-machine interfaces are so important, if we don't get it to a KPP, or at least a KSA, that doesn't incentivize the DoD service labs, it doesn't incentivize industry, and it doesn't incentivize our counterparts in academia to do one bit of work on it. But the second you make it a KPP, then you start having requirements generators from the Air Force, Marines, Army, Space Force, et cetera, go, well, how would I write that requirement? Let's go to the service labs and industry, and we got to put some numbers around this. We actually have to think more deeply about the problem and make it work for the people. So a lot of people will throw this on industry and say industry makes bad HMIs. And industry does make bad HMIs at times, but we specify no HMIs. So the fact that we get anything out of it, right, is magical sometimes, and it's mostly because users pound on the desk. So from my perspective, we can have a lot of discussion about why we don't do it, but if you're talking about a root cause analysis, it's because it sits down at a level of requirements that doesn't incentivize a thing. So that is a top of my priority list when you look at the strategy. Is there's a lot of things that we need to do, but the argument is if we point the department in this direction and we don't address that key challenge, then the resources will not flow to have to flow, and then the human-machine interfaces and the control of AI will not reach their intended consequences, which means we won't have the systems perform operationally. We'll watch a movie and we'll say, that's what I want, which is not uncommon in our world, but we won't be able to materialize it because we don't have the resources.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, 100%. So following up on that, what do you think the status is of HMI integration in other sectors, and more importantly, within our adversaries?
Yeah, I'll give the same response Shane did within context, which is there's no doubt that our peer competitors are investing in this heavily. And really, just like our focus areas around decision dominance. And I think it's important to unpack the difference between decision superiority and information or data dominance. So having data dominance is collecting things from sensors and having access to it. Now you got to pass it across networks or do local edge stuff to turning into information that's usable. But the last 10 meters is getting it to groups of individuals, probably not co-located, or an individual to help make a decision, right? So that's the decision dominance we're looking for. We know that our adversaries are looking at the same priority areas we are, which is tactical data to decision and action at the edge. How we can help with distributed command and control. I hate to use the word JADC2 because there's really no J in it, but how do we do that in an MDO fight where you have JTACs on the ground, Anglo long range fires off both with a space and EW view to make a common decision. And by the way, which service has that, right? So back to the ologies of it, the hierarchical part and making a joint task force about how it organizes is one portion of that, but what type of information they have to have at different places to integrate into the same decision-making span without 15 common operating pictures is really the speed that we need in the OODA loop. And then at the end is the psychology, which is which one of those commanders in the service is going to give up command for a joint task force command. Now, some places they do that really well, so we have places to model that on, but in general, the services do not do that well. And then if you scale with the partners, we have other challenges. So we got a lot of work to do in that space on the technology and the human side. So we are again, like Shane said, we are on par with our allies in some places, and we're behind. Our democracy doesn't allow us to necessarily work as fast as others, so we have to work smarter, I think.
Absolutely. In your opinion, how does the DoD's current approach to HMI technology adoption impact operational effectiveness?
I mean, if current is past, it de-optimizes it, right? We have a promise of a technology, again, whether it's a PVI for a pilot, whether it's robotics control, almost anything we do, when we don't put enough of the human-machine interfaces into it, then what we think and imagine that will do operationally, and what we test against rigorously, that doesn't test against anything almost operationally, doesn't meet the goals of that requirement. So the truth of the matter is, anytime we don't pay attention enough to the HMIs, it de-optimizes operational outcomes. And the number of use cases are, I mean, probably you could say almost every system, but there are a bunch of systems that, and we did it again recently with another, I don't know if it was an aircraft or a ship, but when things bang into each other, something goes wrong, you'll notice that it's always pilot error, or it's always human error. Has nothing to do with the fact that the HMIs were untenable and no one had indications and warnings, and that the machine degraded in this kind of way but wasn't understood by the human. So the human is the loop right now. Like for the foreseeable future, despite the fact that we are in fact going to have great additive capabilities from autonomy and AI, what we really have to understand and figure out is where is human in and on the loop, and not so much when will they not be, but what do they have to do when they have to see to a technology, right? That's a better way to say it. When I have to see to an AI or see to an RAS with AI and I'm informed, or a JAD-CDU decision with some kind of COAs laid at me, how do I see to that? And as we get smarter and smarter autonomy, we might be less in contact, but when we have to make the decision, it's likely more critical, because the other main question that emerges is, what does it mean to be out of the loop and then have to make a decision? So if you have to plan a mission for 4 days and everyone's around the MDMP process, then everyone ingrains exactly the trade-offs of what it means. If an AI generates a mission and you just go execute it, I don't know what your pace plans are. You haven't walked through them, not just the pace plan you put out, but every scenario you've walked your way through. So taking human out of the loop is a critical discussion, which frankly I don't think we've had at a level enough, and which is why I'll foot stomp the need for experimentation, right? So the fastest way to get to a place is to include the squishy human people, right? Which is, by the way, one of the more complex things in the universe, which is infinitesimally harder than a deterministic system. Get them in the same places as the users, which means we have to increase the early work in this space far left of PM is while we kind of pull this out. That's the only way we're going to get it. So the experimentation budgets need to go up. We need to realize what they are, but we also have to have S&T focused in these fairly narrow areas. We can't spread peanut butter as far as we want to in the past. We have to get very precise, and even so precise as the use cases, right? So that context makes a difference, and context is king in psychology. You can have the same information here. You change the context, it's an entirely different decision. So from the user perspective, we need those user communities to say, under these conditions and constraints, here's the priority that we need to have actioned on the operational side, and then you can derive your requirements both on the human and machine teaming.
Absolutely, which is a really great segue into talking about bridging the gap, and in particular what you're doing and the roadmap that you're building out to doing so.
Yeah, so our remit as PDs, right, so I'm at OSD, so I'm of the opinion that we shouldn't build Seattle Space Needles, right? I don't want to have a ton of resources at OSD. What I want to do is empower the services where the gap has been identified. So our remit for year one is develop the vision, strategy, and roadmap, which I'll be presenting tomorrow. It's early, it's still draft since the 3 and 4 stars haven't chopped it. Is to provide that as an azimuth and direction of where the department has to go. To get there, again, we team with the stakeholders, but in addition to that, we have workforce assessments, infrastructure and range for experimentation assessments, the IC, right? So we got to do red, green, blue analysis. Really, we have to identify also the redundancies, gaps, both within and across services. So next year, CAPE and OMB will come to me after we publish and say, where are the redundancies within and between services that we can reduce so that we can then take that and prioritize towards HMI goals. Because what being a CTA means is, while it might have been down here at the IPPL and unresourced before, there's 14 of them, so it's coming to the top. And the role is to really champion that and to make, one is to get the word out, but also to work within the building and within the departments, ASALT, DAS and RNT, AFQ, AF, to make sure that the equities that the HMI CTA has are adopted by those services. It's not really a request, right? Which is why we spent so much time with the services and trying to unpack their equities in this. So if Ms. Shu decides the space to define it, then what we put in that box for priorities has come from stakeholders. That's the only way I know how to do it.
As a taxpayer, I absolutely love that. So I've heard you talk about the solution set for sound HMI practice as a 3-legged stool. Can you talk us through that solution set?
Yeah, I think we've talked about it a little here. It's clearly, like, we don't deliver teaming, right? We deliver technology that enables operational outcomes. But the strongest and the best approach is really to wrap around that technology, right? The scientists and the experts and the user community that is embedded in it, because the different user communities have different levels of capability, understanding, and frankly, culture, right? So if you go to JSOC and SOCOM, you're going to get a ton of senior NCOs who are going to drive your train right down the path you want, and you're going to have enough chutzpah to push back when it's technically unsound. If you go other places, you're going to get 10,000 ideas, N equals 1, that you can't consolidate into a plan. But what you really need is the move through when users see that something is either real or not real, that's what they respond to, right, from an operational outcome perspective. So really it's the engineering, it's the human systems, and it's the strong user communities. And those user communities often have to get pared down or pushed aside with regards to how do you compartment all their problems without trying to have one system solve all the problems for them. And then if they can prioritize them, you can talk about how you eat the elephant, not that you just want to make one.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I've watched you build this out, and obviously you're still in the early stages of it, I have been really impressed with the amount of data collection and user integration that you've done. You guys have spent a really lot of time going out to survey the community across all services, across industry, across academia, bringing people together who think differently and who can really, almost go to blows having a discussion. We've seen that at a working group.
Perfect.
And I think that that's just really, it's fantastic, and it's great to see that systematic approach that you're taking. So with that, what are the main resourcing gaps that hinder the DoD's adoption into these technologies?
Yeah, well, I think there's two, right? So again, with the two approaches, that there's a long-term commitment gap within each of the services, that there's nothing robustly HMI, right? And there's two sections to the HMI technologies. One is really information portrayal technologies, so mixed, augmented, virtual reality, but not just visual, right? Oral, haptic. How do we provide information for decision making and decision makers? And the other is the simplified control of complex systems, or simplified control in complex environments of simple systems, right? So you can't be head down in a RAS controlling it and expect SA. If you're fighting CCAs, you can't turn the pilot into a fire team leader who just has another knee board and 16 more buttons to push. Like it's probably going to be the early way, right? You play the hand you're dealt, but it can't be the long-term strategy. There's got to be better ways to do it. So the biggest resourcing gaps, I would say, is in the services commitment without a demand signal, because it's buried in that human challenge, right? So there's no resourcing. And frankly, let's be honest with this. Human sciences that gets behind this, and the humans in industry, is not what makes the defense industrial base move, right? This is an optimization discussion, so it has to be thought about pretty well. But I think there are places in the department, and that's kind of the plan the next couple of years, where people already have missions, responsibilities, and authority to attack this. So if you look at in OSD-R&E, you've got the AppFit accelerated procurement, you got the Rider and T-Rex, where we will forcefully insert HMIs in this next year, not asking, right? If you want to control 500 of whatever systems you got, you need to have an HMI plan, right? AUKUS pillars, everything we're doing. So there's also money in ranges and TRMC, there's DIU, there's DARPA for the very hard problems. So we've laid out where those resources are. Those people are chartered to fund these kind of efforts. And now that it's a priority, our job is to get with our service partners on these most critical gaps that we found over the last 10 months, which will continue to be refined, and the people who do have the money and those resources. And the hope is also that the services don't stop funding midterm science on behalf of the near-term requirements, because it's not in their remit, and you don't want to take the seeds of tomorrow away by pulling everything into EMD, right? You changing money from 6.3 or 6.2 to 6.4 doesn't make the science and technology revolutions go any faster, right? So those are the two challenges we face. But that's also why the CTAs exist. It was recognized that this was not an area that was funded heavily. Moreover, near peers were funding it, and if these gaps aren't addressed, then all of our aspirational goals with the technology are not going to be realized, whether it's TI and autonomy, whether it's our pilots, whether it's RAS systems, even in the cyber and space realms, we have serious challenges that HMI has to be involved in for dynamic decision-making and predictive analysis that makes you know the history of a system and what the projected outcomes are when you have to make the flash to bang decision.
And as a follow-up to that, what strategic investments do you believe are necessary for DoD to catch up in HMI technology?
Well, I think I said some of it is the services and the service S&T labs haven't got a strong demand signal for this. So it's not about doing things wrong, but their resources have to increase in these spaces, which means they also have to do something that's very hard, which is divest of things that are no longer a high priority. If this thing comes to the top of the IPPL in the top 10, something fell off, where's that funds, what is it? It needs to come with this, right? So those are simple. I mean, if you've been playing the POM game, if you don't come above the snap line, you don't get funded. Now we just got to tell people this is above the snap line. So what are the things that can't be funded because of this? But the other gap, I think, is it's not really resourcing, but is the focus, is the intuitive or the heuristic is the right word, is people's intuitive knowledge that if they don't get this quite right, Josephine or Joe is going to solve it for them, right? The most flexible part of this complexity is going to kind of make do with what they have, which in earlier, I mean, that served us well for so long, but in this near peer, it simply will not. If we expect to work in this new environment, cross-domain, cross-service, and have this contribution within the OODA loop of the enemy, and that OODA loop is essentially, that's the human. Like if autonomy is attritable, or it's doing its own thing, that's going to give us great rewards. But when you have to control it, or when you have to do something with it, it better be fast, easy, and simple, or else you're not going to meet your metric, and that's going to have much more severe consequences in the future.
Right, and within that, I would imagine that ecosystem development would be very important, right? So that you can get all of these best of breeds in one place,
Yeah.
and communicate better across the services.
Yeah, two of our main thrusts we're going to start building out next year is an applied research consortium across industry, academia, and the services, which brings people together on these focus areas that we have in the CTA, right? And creates the ecosystem of folks who have experience and can focus on this area, so that when resources do flow, we are pushing it into places where the expertise already exists. We don't want to create new cottage industries. People can come aboard, but we don't want somebody for first time in academia deciding they want to study mixed reality because there's funds there, right? We're going to find the ecosystem first and build it. But that also includes our partners in Five Eyes and TTCP. The other thing we're doing is starting to stand up, and the plan to stand up regional centers of excellence, right, around HMI technologies, of where do those exist and how do the resources go. So that's really about building the ecosystem of partners to include users and a place to do that very experiment we need. So one of our first looks is, before reinventing the wheel and creating a bunch of capital investment that's redundant, where are those centers of excellence currently that we can tag into, and how do we layer on top of that, like the robotics ranges and the AI tools. Like, we don't have to recreate the whole thing. We just have to lay on top to make sure the HMIs in our prioritized spaces are done well. So again, being resource and fiscally responsible, we're going to stand up the ecosystem and a place to do experimentation that allows us those lessons learned. Now, those lessons learned will be from industry and academia in the service labs, and that, to your point, is a shared best practice which gets put in a repository that already exists, so that people in the future don't have to relearn the lesson. But I've been into plenty of meetings when both our service labs and myself or someone else and industry are around the table having a debate about what the best practice is to implement for the user, and the user's nowhere to be seen. So if we have combined best practices and let the users decide what they are, we can solve those problems, as well as establish future gaps that even if they weren't successful in that turn, we know what we have to do to try to get it to the next tranche.
Excellent. I think we're going to pivot to some questions from the audience now.
So the first question is related to, the question itself is, much of the game-changing developments in XR come from the open source community. Commercial solutions don't have the features and capabilities at the pace of the open source community. This is often a showstopper for government implementation and what can be done to overcome it. But I'd like to change that a little bit, because I object to, having seen some open source software and having seen some Android and Apple software, I take some objection to that question, in that many of the HMI interfaces inside of the proprietary systems are also relatively fully fledged. And the question is, how do we navigate the waters between open source and proprietary solutions for HMI, especially when those HMIs are being used to control, human agent swarms?
Yeah. Well, I think we've probably understated this. We can overstate it as well. Like going from a bunch of systems that don't interoperate together, from a lack of ICDs and a lack of common architectures and a lack of data environments, you can't magically go to MOSA and everything's magically connected, right? It's unobtainium. So I think the approach is to, again, within like an ecosystem that we're developing, is to talk about where those spots are most incongruent, right? And start building where you have to have the commonality of ICDs, who one's up. And frankly, I think the government needs to do, and I've again been in industry as well, we have to do a better job of putting our money where our mouth is when it comes to data rights and what we do and don't want, and the IP requirements, and just the interfaces, with the same look of, I think, data looks, and to make sure we're not trusting black boxes that we shouldn't be trusting, especially when we're talking about AI and autonomy. So I think there's a balanced approach, but I think it has to be brought together in what I would call a constellation of capabilities. And you have a much easier ability to talk about how do you interconnect these capabilities, and what kind of architectural views and ICDs do you need for this operational outcome, as opposed to talking on some kind of generalized open strategy or open software architecture. But I do think we should be leveraging best-in-class systems, and sometimes, to the earlier points, we can get on our way with regards to how we do this. And I think some good examples reside across all of the labs. And I've been in labs, and I've been in P-shops, and I've been in industry, so I'm not sharpshooting. I'm just saying there's an argument out there that talks about MOSA these days in laboratories that goes something like, well, we have to build it where the government, otherwise it's a vendor lock. Because I'm like, every time you award a new contract, it's a vendor lock. I don't know what you're talking about. Like PM perspective. You award a new contract, you have a new vendor, that's a vendor lock. It's 4 years. That's not really the challenge. The challenge is, how do we maintain an architecture that feeds data into systems that the government has rights to and owns and can take, while still protecting our industry's basic IP, how they do their business, and even their special sauces, so they can come together. It's not one or the other. But we do a good deal of blocking in this space as well contractually.
Wonderful. So you mentioned needing an HMI plan for future projects, but what does this plan need to have? Does it need to go deep in psychology, or do you spend resources on development for effective 3D interfaces, or do you keep assessment light? Or
say that again.
Slower.
Do you go deep into the psychology of interfaces and HMI, or do you spend resources on development for effective 3D interfaces? Or do you keep assessment light and focus on capabilities and have bare bones HMI interfaces in favor of additional capability development? How do you navigate those waters between psychology, computers, and capability?
Yeah, so my background tells me we focus on operational outcomes that are prioritized for the department, and we nest the others in that, right? So if we're not talking about aligning with the operational priorities of the department, then one would beg the question, why are you funding that in the first place? Tomorrow we'll go much more in depth with this, but we have, again, those two technology focus areas, information portrayal technologies, which has substantial challenges in it still from an R&D perspective in some spaces, but also an industry-based challenge we have that we're addressing with our microelectronics community. Simplified control is the second technology area. The third thrust area is really human system sciences behind that, but appointed human sciences to make sure that those technologies are informed from the human perspective, right? Not a generalized physiological monitoring or like nested problems of why we aren't delivering better technology. So I think we'd have to go to tomorrow to kind of understand it, but we have 3 mission areas and we have 4 technology thrust areas. Where there's overlay is where the initial strategy amounts to, and we have some constraints. We're not interested in every operational use case. We're interested in those use cases where the DoD won't magically get something for free if we don't invest in our own problems. We're gonna get telemedicine for free. We're gonna get just-in-time training for free, right? These things are done in industry. Investments in those spaces where we need to invest in the places that are DoD unique that also have dual-use technologies that we're not gonna get for free. No one's gonna invest in JADC2 requirements, right? Those kind of things.
Absolutely. If I can comment on that too. That question, I think, really leaves me scratching my head, because what I think is mission outcomes. That's what matters first, right? Good guys need to win, bad guys need to lose. Period, dot, in the story. So what is the mission objective? And then what are the things that you need to get to that mission objective? If we don't start with winning, right, as our primary goal, we're never going to get there. We're going to get distracted with all of the yeahs and buts and, you know, everything else. So I really think it's really important that we put the human first. And when I say mission success, that's the good guys coming home, the good guys and gals coming back home to be with their families. That's the number 1 priority.
So oftentimes the non-technical users have difficulties imagining what types of systems can put that winning first, whether it be this system or this system or this system or some other system that they can't envision yet. And the question from the audience is, to what extent are you utilizing design-based prototyping approaches to bridge the gap between what people think can exist and what can actually exist?
No, it's great. I think it's one of our keys. If I'm reading it right, it's one of the keys to our strategy, which is one of the best use cases for the technologies we're seeing at these shows are the ability to put ourselves in situations where we can't get it in the JRX or out in a training range, where we can get the reps and sets against a ton of different MET-Ts and different challenges, not after we've built a tool, but before we've done it, to do our robust DevSecOps and analysis and trade-off with users in virtual environments that prescribe the engineering outcomes needed instead of building the tool and then throwing over the fence in the field, which I've lived as a PM. I know someone else has lived it for years, right? But those immersive environments, whether it's actual AI and a virtual assistant in JADC2, whether it's a PVI for a pilot interface, or whether it's controlling your next drone that has multi-capabilities, you can do all those things in these immersive environments. We're doing relatively little of that in all of our CDDs. That is perhaps one of the biggest gaps in what we're going to attack on the ranges and infrastructure as well. Because once you can get people doing that, then that's early experimentation of what has to become and actually drives engineers in the better direction for having users up front in their problems. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm so pleased to hear virtual reality-based prototyping and concept-based design coming out of some of the DoD senior leaders. Been pushing that for quite some time.
It might be one. Now I have to realize it.
And turning back over to Leah. And
all right. Well, I think we're ready to close up. I would like to again plug your session tomorrow afternoon at 1500 in the Navy room, correct?
Yep.
So that's where Dr. Palmer will talk about the draft plan and strategy and really walk through it in more detail.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.